Hello there, and welcome to How the Rock Got Rolling. My name's Chris. We're going to take you through some of the history of rock and roll, the singers, songwriters, bands, and some of the meanings behind the songs. On this episode, we're going to take a look at one of the most iconic songs ever made. It spent 8 weeks on the Billboard charts, including 2 more weeks at number 1. It's 1971's American Pie by Don McLean. There are a lot of stories behind that, a lot of theories, and Don McLean has never come forward and said anything about the music himself or what prompted him to write it. But basically, he writes about the day the music died. February 3rd, 1959. That was the day that J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, Ritchie Valens, and 22-year-old Buddy Holly lost their lives in a plane crash in Iowa. McLean was 13 years old at the time, and he saw the news as he was folding newspapers for his paper route. The significance of the song is not so much that it was the day the music died, but it was more the day the music began. It's the story of an entire generation as told in terms of its music, rock and roll. It tells of a loss of innocence in America as we came out of the 50s and into the 60s with protest music, psychedelia, the Vietnam War, Kent State, the Manson murders, and Woodstock. It also showed for the first time how youth could have a driving voice in American politics and help shape policy for years to come. The song itself starts innocently enough, with McLean singing about who wrote the book of love and do you have faith in God above, and that he saw the girl he had an unrequited love for dancing with somebody else, and she knew that she was in love with him because they both kicked off their shoes. But then the song takes a different turn, flash forwarding to 1970, saying, "For 10 years we've been on our own, and moss grows fat on a rolling stone, but that's not the way it used to be." It then flashes back to when the jester, a.k.a. Bob Dylan, sang for the king and queen in a coat he borrowed from James Dean, and in a voice that came from you and me. Bob Dylan was the voice of an entire generation in the early 60s. He spoke for you and me in his protest songs like Blowin' in the Wind, All Along the Watchtower, and Hey Mr. Tambourine Man, which was later covered by the Byrds. In the verse, while the king was looking down, the jester stole his thorny crown. The king is alternately believed to be either Elvis Presley or God himself because of the thorny crown reference. Either way, it was a voice of the youth of America, and Bob Dylan was the voice for that generation. The verse also was a foreshadowing of the turbulent times coming to America. In the next verse, and while Lennon read a book of Marx, the quartet practiced in the park. That told of the British invasion and the coming of the most famous band in the world, the Beatles, one of the biggest influences on music, if not the biggest, ever. As you can probably tell from the verses, the song itself hops back and forth from the early 60s to the mid-60s to the late 60s to the mid-60s and back. It doesn't really have any chronological order of what happened. It just tells the story of rock and roll in the 1960s from a certain standpoint. Helter Skelter in the Summer Swelter seems to be a thinly veiled reference to the Manson murders of 1969, where the Tate and LoBianco families were viciously murdered on the orders of Charles Manson. Manson and his followers would later be tried in court and were found guilty of mass murder and were originally sentenced to death, but when California put a moratorium on the death penalty, their sentences were converted to life imprisonment. Manson would eventually die in prison. From there, the song seems to flash back to 1967 and the Summer of Love, where it talks about the birds flew off with a fallout shelter 8 miles high and falling fast. Not too sure what that means. I have a feeling it means something about the Monterey Pop Festival and the end of folk music, as we knew it anyway, as other bands started coming in, like the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, who were more into playing folk music with a psychedelic twist to it. It later became known as acid rock. In the verse, at halftime there was sweet perfume, while sergeants played a marching tune. We all got up to dance, but we never got the chance. Talking about the Beatles again, 1967's magnum opus, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and how it affected pretty much everybody. It was one of the finest albums ever made, and was one of the biggest influences on music for years to come. The final verse on the song, before it goes into the bridge, and there we were all in one place, a generation lost in space, with no time left to start again. This, of course, was a reference to Woodstock in 1969, where 500,000 plus people gathered in New York for 3 days of peace, love, and music. And that's exactly what it was. 3 days of peace, love, and music. No rioting, no fighting. It was all about the music. There's also a reference to the concert in Altamont in 1969 as a gift by the Rolling Stones to the youth of California. It was a day-long festival with the Rolling Stones as the headliners, which tragically resulted in the death of a young man murdered at the hands of the Hells Angels, who were providing security. The concert itself was filmed and released in 1970 with the title Gimme Shelter. The final part of the song, McLean sings, I met a girl who sang the blues, and I asked her for some happy news, but she just smiled and turned away. The reference was obviously to Janis Joplin, who died in 1970 of a heroin and alcohol overdose. It signified the loss of innocence in America, and that the 1960s had not only been tumultuous, but history-making as well. It was as if the music had died once again. I went down to the sacred store, where I'd heard the music play before, but the man there said the music wouldn't play. This is more symbolic, I think, than actual reality. I think he felt that as the 60s ended, so did the importance of rock music, in a way. It would never be this political or highly charged again. And in the streets, the children screamed, the lovers cried, and the poets dreamed. But not a word was spoken. The church bells all were broken. This signifies the end of the nuclear family of the 50s, where father always knew best. It showed that youth had a voice, a very powerful one. It sent a message to those in power that the youth were taking over America and that one day they would be running the country. And they had concerns. Concerns about the Vietnam War, about being drafted, and about living a life that they chose to live and not have the government choose it for them. These were things that were never questioned in the past. If you were drafted, you went into the service and you served your time because your country had called you and it was the thing you had to do. No one before had ever challenged it until the 1960s, and because Vietnam was not actually a declared war, but a police action and not an actual threat to our national security, the draft soon ended, and the move was made toward an all-volunteer military. Now, these are just some of the subjects that were covered in American Pie, and of course, they're all theories. I can't really say what Don McLean actually meant in the song, whether any of this is accurate or not. And nobody will know. When he was asked one time about what American Pie means to him, his reply was that I never have to work again if I don't want to. Which is true. He still receives about $400,000 yearly simply for the name American Pie. They had to pay him for the American Pie movies to use that title. And every time the song is played, he receives a royalty. American Pie is one of the most important songs in all of music. An 8.5-minute epic that tells a story from a certain point of view of a turbulent time in America that should never be forgotten. Don McLean would go on to more fame and fortune and more hit songs in the 70s and the early 80s. In 2000, Madonna recorded her version of American Pie. Don McLean said he was very proud of what she did. It took a lot of guts, and he thought that her interpretation was an awesome one. And in 2017, McLean's original version of American Pie was selected for preservation in the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or artistically significant. It's a timeless song that doesn't grow old or fade over time. It's a song that'll be heard for generations to come. Well, that's the history of American Pie, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about it as much as I enjoyed talking about it. Rock and roll is a passion for me. It is something I have studied for years and years, since I was a teenager anyway. I love it. I love to look at the history behind it. I love to look at the bands, the singers, the songwriters. I love it all, and I hope you did too. Coming up in future podcasts, we'll talk about progressive rock, punk rock, one of my favorite subjects, the new wave, and 80s and 90s with grunge, everything going into the modern day. Meanwhile, I hope you enjoyed listening to How the Rock Got Rolling. I'm Chris, and we'll see you again next time.